Hello and welcome to the Big Six Podcast. Sam McKewon along with the Silver Tongue. Evan Bland taking a break from College World Series duty, taking a break from his yard sale that he's going to have on Friday at the same time that Adrian Martinez is going to have his yard sale. Selling all his Husker gear. Evan's going to be selling all of his Husker stories.
Wow!
Right on his front lawn. Did you know that Adrian was having a yard sale?
As of like 10 minutes ago, I did.
Well, that's when he told
out
everybody.
there in Papillion. Yeah. How cool is that?
Yeah. You sure you want to put that on Twitter, Adrian?
That's going to draw a crowd.
Like if you were selling it for like $2,000, I could see doing that. If the stuff's like $20 and less, why don't you just let everybody kind of walk by and they'll get whatever they want. I love him.
That's going to be fun.
I missed him as the quarterback last year. He's such a good guy and such an unassuming guy in so many different ways. I got to think that Casey Thompson would not have gone with yard sale. I don't know. He would have done something a little bit different. And he's going to have to.
He might have been a Facebook Marketplace guy.
He's going to have to. So Casey's got his Texas gear.
That's right.
And he's got his Husker gear.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty soon he'll have his Florida Atlantic gear. I wonder if Jeff Sims is selling his Georgia Tech gear, for a little extra.
Yeah, not yet. Maybe at the end of his career. That seems like something you do when you're done.
That's right.
I suppose. I don't know. It'll be, yeah, you put that out there on Twitter in Papillion. He's doing it in Papillion, like on the cheap.
Yeah.
I imagine that's going to be of interest for a number of people.
That's
so
right.
They can check that out on Twitter.
Quite a crowd that amasses there. Well, many years ago, Adrian Martinez was the top recruit in the 2018 recruiting class. Recruiting is going to be the name of the game today. We're going to talk a whole bunch about it. We're seeing some things that seem relatively unprecedented in Nebraska recruiting history, and I'm not exaggerating. There are kids who have offers from no other schools, and they're not from here. They're kids from all over the country who have very few Power 5 offers, in some cases no other FBS offers. And Nebraska's offering them, putting them on the board as part of their recruiting class, and they're committing. Mm-hmm. And I think there's been multiple kids about whom that would be the story, and they committed over the weekend. It's really interesting. It's a little different. We haven't seen this very often. We're going to talk about what we think they're doing, why they're doing it, why they're comfortable doing it, why fans could be concerned, why they shouldn't be concerned, why it's probably a smart strategy, and then we're going to preview this coming weekend, which promises to be really interesting. You have the two Bellevue West wide receivers coming, you have a top 100 offensive lineman coming, you have a running back coming, and they need a running back in the class, so on and so on and so on. So there's a lot going on. There. We'll talk a little bit about Jordy Ball. She was earlier in the week, talked to the press. We've talked already about her, but we'll talk a little bit more about her. We'll talk a little baseball, what they've done with their recruiting class. I don't think we've been on a podcast since Rob Childress took the job.
That's right.
I don't think we've talked about that. We'll talk about it briefly, mostly his impact in the recruiting realm, because it seems like they're getting some pretty darn good baseball players. And I don't know. We'll talk maybe a little basketball. Probably not. There's not that much basketball to talk about. Rick Mast met with reporters yesterday, and it was good. He's all the things that you would want a fifth-year senior to be, and he's going to be a clear leader. Can he make threes? Can he make the right passes? Those are things that you only learn once you get into the season. Okay, I want to remind everybody to subscribe to the Omaha World-Herald. We've got a deal right now, whole year, $26. That's a heck of a deal. If today is June 21st, 22nd?
22nd, yeah.
22nd. So you get all the way until next year, next June 22nd. You get almost all of the CWS. You get the full first year of Matt Rhule. Holy crap. You get Nebraska volleyball and everything that's going on with them. Yep. The only thing you don't get with it is a free glass of beer that you're going to be able to now buy at the Nebraska Volleyball Day in Nebraska, because they approved that today at Memorial Stadium. We'll be able to sell booze for the country music concert and the volleyball game that'll have 90,000 people at it. So cool for them. Okay, let's get into it, Evan. You've been covering the CWS, so you have been able to kind of watch what's been going on over the last week or so in recruiting, or maybe 2 weeks, from afar. There's actually a value in that perspective because you're not sort of immersed in it and talking to these recruits or whatever, but you know Nebraska's recruiting stories over many years. What in the hell do you think is going on from outside looking in?
Yes, and that's exactly right, Sam. Like this happens every June when the College World Series rolls around. Like I feel like I'm as distant from the program as at any point in the year. And, typically this is the time of year when the Friday Night Lights camps have come around and you see some of the mega stars roll in and they wow the handful of people that show up at Memorial Stadium, and you kind of can see the seeds being laid for guys who will make their decisions either later in the summer or into the fall. And it's just been such a different vibe this year where, we already knew that Nebraska was going to put more emphasis on these camps. Matt Rhule has said many times if it's going to be a first-class program, he wants to have a first-class experience for any campers that come in. And that's great, right? Like I think that makes a lot of sense. But when some of these guys have come in as relative unknowns, as you said, with no real fanfare, no recruiting stars, if they have a recruiting profile, it's a blank, faceless outline. In most cases, it's different. It's if it's one guy, then it's one thing. But as you said, this has become a trend where they've not only evaluated these guys in person, they've put out offers, and as we found, they're committable offers. Usually, guys like that, you maybe string along for a while and say, let's check in a month or two. We like you, but we maybe don't have a spot for you right now. They're giving these spots to these players now, and to me, it speaks to the conviction that this staff has in its vision and what it does. Like, I don't think if you're a first-year coach or a new staff, like you don't. I think you would be. You wouldn't have maybe the confidence to go ahead and pull that off right away. But these guys are so confident in their blueprint and their system, what they're looking for, that they're not afraid to take these guys. So I think that part has been really striking. And we'll see how it pans out. We saw a little bit of it at the end of the 23 cycle with some of the players that they took late. And now we're seeing it some more. So Matt Rhule and company are putting a lot of stock in their evaluation tools and how well they do that. And it's going to be really fascinating to see over the course of time how that pays off.
So the names specifically that we're kind of going through here, in order, Braylon Prude, who got an offer at the Houston Christian University satellite camp, 6'4", 6'5", 190, maybe a safety, maybe a linebacker. Braylon Prude, whose other offer was Eastern Illinois. Jake Peters, who had good offers, but he was short. He's like 6'2 and a half, 6'3", 270. He had good offers, but he didn't really have any Power 5 offers, I think, just mostly because of his height. But South Dakota State was there. The service academies were there. And you know what? Those schools play good football. Mm-hmm. And he can play. He is a good player who just happens to be a little bit short. So Jake Peters makes a lot more sense. I think that's one where you're like, you know what? We're comfortable with his height. He's a great athlete. He can move. He plays basketball. He kind of looks a little bit like Cam Jurgens. Like, we like him. That one makes more sense.
Sure.
Callan Barta, his top offer was Missouri Southern. He went to a Under Armour camp in Kansas City on May 30th, won MVP at that camp. We used to cover the hell out of rivals and Under Armour camps. We don't do that anymore. Some of that is staffing. Some of that is the recruiting services have moved on. They just don't do as much of it anymore. Everybody's talking about NIL. But this kid goes to an Under Armour camp, does a hell of a job, wins the MVP. Nebraska basically does with him what Iowa did with Michael Burt. So Michael Burt just committed to Iowa today. He goes down to Lindenwood University, has a great camp. Iowa invites him up. Burt didn't have any recruiting stars next to his name before Iowa did that. So it's not unlike that. The difference is that Burt got Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Illinois all in a row. Callan Barta, KU, and K-State held off. They didn't offer. So Nebraska gave him invited him up to camp. He gets the offer at camp. He comes to an official visit. So this is really Nebraska got his commit over Missouri Southern and Emporia State, where his older brother plays. And so that's a shocker. I don't know that Nebraska's ever had anybody from the city of Topeka. Maybe they have, and I just don't remember it. But that's not necessarily a bastion of football. Usually it's KC, Wichita, Salina, And then there's usually a kid or two out west. Topeka doesn't tend to be that place. So a surprise there. Evan Taylor, he had an offer to Rutgers. He had an offer to East Carolina. He got offered based on his film. He didn't camp at Nebraska, but he got an offer based on his film, took a visit to Nebraska. He's in the boat as well. I think there's a chance that Donovan Jones will commit from Omaha North. He didn't have any offers before he came to a camp, a Friday Night Lights camp at Nebraska. Wyoming was at the camp. Wyoming offered him. Nebraska offered him too. Now, will he commit to Nebraska? So there's a mixture there. There's some in-state guys. There's some local guys. There's a guy that went to an Under Armour camp. There's a guy that was at a satellite camp. In every single case, they got an evaluation. Mm-hmm. So they have evaluated these players. But at the same time, I think the question becomes, well, why not slow play a few of them?
Right.
Why not see what you can do with this player over here and this player over here? And, if you got to come back to Braylon Prude in 2 months, he'll be there. If you got to come back to Calvin Barter in 2 months, what's going to change? Kansas offering him? That kind of thing. To that response, and I got a really good email, and I'm going to kind of respond in a rewind that's going to run Monday to respond to this, because I do have some thoughts on it. First of all, the calendar is such now, and it would be more clear if we had 2 signing periods. If we had an earlier signing period like in July,
right,
it would be clear. But the calendar is such now where you basically have a July signing period, but it doesn't exist. It's silent. You commit by the end of July or mid-July, and you're in the class. And chances of you moving from the class are dependent on whether somebody tries to kick you out of the class because they don't like what you're doing, or you get in trouble or whatever. But effectively, you put together the majority of your class by late July. And functionally, it's not late July. There is a week in late July where kids can take visits. But functionally, it's by the beginning of July, because most coaches take off for most of July. And there's a dead period in early July, the 4th of July. So unless you're a team that's going to put a lot of eggs in your basket and have like a late July recruiting event, Urban Meyer used to, you're pretty much done by late June. So the idea that you're going to get this kid's commit in 2 months while you play through your other options doesn't really exist, because a lot of times the options they just go off the radar. They just disappear. They prepare for their high school seasons. And so I can understand wanting to knock some of these things out. I understand if you got Landon Davidson, go get him. He never made it to that Colorado visit that he may have loved. If you really want Jake Peters and you think he can play football for you, go get him. Don't screw around with waiting and seeing if Iowa State suddenly gets interested. Get him in the boat now. They're going to feel loyalty to you because you took a chance on them. And I heard this from 3 different recruits. They took a chance on me when no one else would. Calvin Barta. I feel like I was slept on, and Nebraska took a chance on me. Michael Burt. I feel like every other school was hesitant to give me an offer. They would call me and they'd talk to me, but they wouldn't offer me. Iowa was bold enough to give me an offer. Mm-hmm. 1 went to Iowa, 2 went to Nebraska. In every single case, it's, we like you, we think you're good enough to play here, we're going to offer you, commit to us. And Burt, I think, as a good guy, as a courtesy, visited Nebraska. But I think it was going to be very hard to pull him away from Iowa once Iowa made that move first. So there's some of that. The other thing, and I've said this to you before on this podcast, and I think it's important to reiterate, I do not believe that there is a significant difference between the 210th recruit and, quite frankly, the 490th recruit. I don't think there's a big difference between the 535th recruit and the 920th recruit.
There's a flattening of talent there, flattening of the curve.
I just don't think there is. And it's not because there isn't a difference. Boy, does that make sense. It's because I don't really think that evaluations from recruiting services are that good after about 150. I think they do a hell of a job of saying, here are the very best players. Here are the players that we have seen 6 times. Here are the however many players that we invited to the Elite 11 and watched for 3 days. But I think it's very hard for, and I'm not blaming them, they don't have 100 scouts. It's very hard for them to say, well, this guy over here is probably he's an 83, and this guy's an 87, and I've watched their huddle film. Like, it's just hard to do.
Sure.
And I think that happens quite a bit. I think Nebraska's, under Scott Frost and absolutely under Mike Riley, would sign 4 stars, and we knew Keyshawn Johnson Jr. I'm like, that guy's not a 4-star. I mean, he's built like a tight end, a 6'1" tight end. I'm like, that guy, he's got good hands, but he's not a 4-star receiver. Come on, or of all the players that I've seen Scott Frost sign over however many years, the one that impressed me the most, I'm talking in the totality of Scott Frost's class, was Maurice Washington. I'm like, that guy, it's got something. He's 6'2", and he's a little skinny, but my goodness gracious, he's explosive and dynamic, and he had off the field issues.
He had other baggage, yeah.
But that was the one where I'm like, and Wandale's small, but he's got incredible change of direction. You watch him play running back, and I'm like, that guy makes the first guy miss every time. So there were moments where you could look at it and go, that dude. But I remember having a conversation with Scott Frost. And I think, actually, as it turns out, I think he was wrong. But he actually said the same thing. Because remember there was a time when they weren't going to get Wandale?
Right.
Because Wandale's trainer didn't think he should be at Nebraska. Scott told me some other name. I can't remember the name of the guy. We're standing in the skywalk, and he goes, we can go get this guy over here, and he's about 90% as good as Wandale.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the point being that a lot of these players are actually very tightly bunched together. I think there is something to be said for a top 100 kid. Grant Bricks is coming visiting this weekend. I think he's probably a dude. I think. Jalen Barnett was a top 100 player once upon a time and never played. But, I think there's something to be said for that, and I think there's something to be said for having the number 3 class in the country. So if you get to that Bill Callahan echelon of recruiting, you're doing something. Because you're probably getting some dudes that not only are highly rated players, but almost all highly rated players are actually not divas. They work really hard. They got to that point for a reason. 5 stars don't become 5 stars because they suck or that they don't care. They usually do care. If you get a bunch of 4 stars, high 4 stars and 5 stars, you got something. And I think Bill Callahan got to that point. The problem is that people think that the number 17 class is 23 classes better than number 40, and it's not.
That's what I was just going to say is outside of what, the top 10 classes maybe? Top 15? 7. Okay, top 7 recruiting classes. There's not nearly the gap, right? Like the gap between 6 and 10 is a lot greater than the gap between 21 and 45, maybe. That's an interesting, yeah. I mean, because they're not going to care.
If Jack Campbell grew up in Frisco, Texas, he would have been a top 50 player. Jack Campbell was 6'5" and 200 and whatever, and he runs a 4.5, and he broad jumps whatever he broad jumped, 10.5, jumps a 38. If he lives in Frisco, Texas, instead of wherever the hell he came from in Iowa, he's a 5. He's a 5-star.
Nebraska.
That's what I'm talking about. The kid from Idaho, Gatlin Barrett. Now he's going to a mission, I think, so he's 2 years away. That kid's the best receiver in the country. Who are we kidding? He runs a 10-1. If the kid lived in Georgia, he'd be a 5-star. He lives in Burley, Idaho, so it's like, I don't know what he's playing against guys in Idaho. Well, a 10-1 is a 10-1. It doesn't change anything. So that's what I mean is that Iowa has way better football players than their recruiting rankings give them credit for, and I'm not even talking about what Iowa develops in them. I'm saying that Jack Campbell walked onto campus that talented. He was good when he got there. Who's the center they had a couple years ago? I can't remember his name. Won the Remington?
Yeah.
That kid was great.
He was.
It's just. I mean, you covered Western Iowa football for years.
Mm-hmm.
There's
had
kids
good players.
over there that didn't go into Iowa. This kid isn't a 3-star. I mean, he's great.
Good players.
So I think part of what happens, and again, I'm not trying to knock recruiting services. I'm just saying it's an impossible task, and they naturally concentrate their impossible task in the places where they have the most prospects. Mm-hmm. And so, we've seen this happen before. I'll tell you this much. If Jake Peters is 6'3", 270 pounds, he's bigger than John Raritan. And John Raritan was a 4.5-star. He was like a top 60 recruit, and he was like, I don't know, they listed him at 6'4", but he wasn't 6'4". And if Jake Peters is 6'3", 270, you know who he's bigger than when he came to college?
Who's that?
Cam Jurgens, who was 6'3" and 245 pounds.
That's right.
And became a center. Now, I'm not saying that Peters has got the athleticism that Jurgens had, but he might have 87% of that athleticism, and Cam came to campus as a top 100 guy, as a tight end, and they moved him to center. The point being that, like, I rarely, and you know this about me, I rarely say that we should leave it to the coaches. Like, that's just not my style. Because there's things to question. But I absolutely believe that Matt Rhule and Evan Cooper know a hell of a lot more about what they're looking for than any star system would say.
Here's the one thing
I just do
that I keep thinking back on if I'm worried about it or whatever. Like, I think about their recruiting history at Temple and at Baylor, and we talked about this with Matt Rhule in his office this offseason, this idea that when they were at Temple, they knew that they were not going to beat Penn State head-to-head for some of these top guys. At Baylor, they knew they were not going to beat Texas head-to-head for some of these top guys. And so I wonder, you know, if there's sort of almost a little bit of a sense of like an ugly duckling syndrome still there, where now they're at Nebraska, which is more of a national player than either of those two schools that he's been at before. I'm curious, you know, if you make that jump as a coaching staff to say, okay, we have a vision. These are the guys that we've gone after. We've effectively been able to secure them because they've been under the radar. Do you take that next step forward when you come to a major brand like Nebraska? Like, should they acknowledge where they are, can maybe have a little bit more weight, carry a little bit more weight with these prospects? Or do you stay so committed to what has gotten you to this point, even though in theory you could be in the mix for some of these bigger guys and pursue it that way? Like, that to me is really fascinating because it's worked for them on a smaller level. Do they change it, or do they kind of stick with what's gotten them to this point?
Well, they brought the 5 stars in earlier, so they brought in Dylan Raiola.
But he was kind of an exception, as we've laid out,
Yeah,
because of his connection to the school.
From Matter Day came in too.
Okay.
Now, to be clear, and we talked about this, I've talked about this many times, good luck getting West Coast linemen to come to Nebraska. I don't think they're going to come here. But they took them on visits, and they walked around, and they were at the spring game. So I think Nebraska's trying, and they're trying to, you know, gauge the interest. Gatlin Bear is a really good player. I don't know when he's going to come on a visit, and he's not going to play anywhere until 2026. But, I mean, again, that's an elite player. So they're in on a few of those. I think I would say that there's a little bit of, yes, sure. Like, if we were going to make a comment, and I made this a month or two ago, and I do think it bears out a little bit now. They missed on some guys in the Midwest that went to other schools. So they missed on the kid from South Dakota, the linebacker up there.
Mm-hmm.
They went after Gage Ginther in Colorado. He committed to Tennessee. They went after a couple of kids in KC. They didn't come to Nebraska. They haven't. You know, they kicked the tires on a couple of kids in Iowa. They tried to get the kid who ended up committing to Wisconsin. Can't remember his name. So they tried. I mean, there's some players that just got away from them, you know, that they didn't land. And so I think then you kind of, and Grant Bricks is, you know, are they going to land him? He's a good player, you know.
Right.
So then I think they kind of gone down the list a little bit, and this is where the list is asked. Now, I've really been thinking about, okay, so how could I stand in Nebraska's shoes and say, here are the things that's happened? One thing that we probably forget, Evan, is COVID. So there were no camps in 2020. There were camps in 2021, but as you recall, a lot of that was focused on figuring out who these kids were that didn't get to camp in 2020.
Playing catch up, yep.
So the group that we're talking about right now would have been freshmen in 2021, in the summer of 2021. They would have been coming off of their freshman year. I think, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe going into their freshman year. And then 2022, there's still a little bit of a backlog.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to some degree, if you're talking about a kid like Callan Barta, I think there's a chance that the kid just hasn't had that much exposure. He said he's been going to camps for years, but nobody's paid any attention. Landon Davidson said he went to the Pipeline camp for 3 years, no attention. And I mean, that kid is good. He's 6'4", and he's 305. He beats the crap out of anybody across from him, and he plays for the best team in the state. And I think part of what happens is, and he didn't have a ton of offers. I think Colorado State had offered him, and then KU came through with one. But he kind of wanted to go to Nebraska or Colorado because those were his two favorite teams and whatever. And I just don't think Nebraska was paying any damn attention to him last year when he came through for the camp. They had a lot on their mind.
Yeah. There's a lot going on.
You know, and they had a lot on their mind. And so, like, I think there's reasons for why these things happen. Peters is short, but they want him because they think he can move. You know, the two that are probably the most surprising to me, if I was going to pick two, that are like, one of them would be Prude, because I don't know what he's going to develop into. He's 6'5" and he's 190. He plays at a good school, but, you know, it's hard to tell. His dad, I think, was an NFL player, played at LSU and played for the Ravens. But he's much taller than his dad. And then they must think Elvin Taylor is just a really, really good player because, you know, that kid, now he's really smart. He's like a 4.0 GPA kid, really sharp, may like what Nebraska has to offer academically. But, you know, that kid, I think, he said they have him as a corner, and he didn't look like a corner. He's 6'3", and he's about 190. And when you're that thick, it's usually a safety, but they're recruiting him at corners. So, like, I don't know. That one's a little interesting to me because I feel like they kind of know some people in Charlotte, and so they got his tape.
Sure.
And, you know, we'll see. You know, maybe he's a hell of a player. You just never know. That was one. And then, if I'm honest, I think, you know, Gradney has been hurt, and so apparently he's healthy again. But that would be the other one. It's like, well, how healthy is he? You know, and is he going to have a big senior year? And I think Nebraska's counting on him having a big senior year and saying, okay, this is why we landed him. So I think there's just, yeah, I mean, there's some moments in there where you're like, really? And fans will email me. This fan emailed me a great email about why are the reporters and the recruiting services not raising their eyebrows? And it's a reasonable question. Do we constantly do this where we defend every recruiting strategy and anything that they want to do, you know, works? I mean, in hindsight being 2020, wasn't Calabrasca kind of a dumb idea?
It didn't seem sustainable. I mean, now looking back, for sure.
Wasn't it kind of a dumb thing to try to do?
But what I'll be curious about...
But we didn't say it at the time. We thought it was incredible at the time.
But what about this idea that this is sort of a one-off? Because we've heard Matt Rhule say many times, to this point, Nebraska has not done anything that would make a recruit say, oh, yeah, over the last 5 or 6 years, this is the program that would develop me. This is the program where I would win.
Right.
They haven't done any of that. And so I wonder if this is even just sort of a one-year deal where they know that most of these top guys, it's going to be tough sledding in all the ways that you outlined. They miss a number of local players in the 500-mile radius because what do you have to sell, really, other than hope and what we've done, you know, as a staff, maybe somewhere else. And so, you know, if Nebraska comes out and makes a bowl game this year and they win 7 or they win 8 games and there's that momentum that starts building up, then maybe that 25 cycle, when not only do you have momentum, but your staff has been in place for a year, you're able to build those relationships, maybe it becomes a little bit more conventional. Maybe it becomes a little bit more, you know, just kind of standard in types in those types of players that they're going after. But I just wonder, you know, there just isn't that much to sell at this point. And so this seems like if there's ever a time to revert to like, hey, let's go find the moldable clay that we're looking for, like this is that class okay, you had the 5-star in Dylan Raiola who had a connection to the program. You got to pursue that. You've had a few other guys that you take flyers on, but like, if you're not going to get the top guys because you don't have a track record at Nebraska yet, be true to yourself. Find those moldable guys. So that's another thing to me that I'll be curious about is, does this become a pattern every year moving forward, or does some success translate to more of a conventional maybe approach in 25 and beyond?
I do think they have things to sell. I mean, they have a new facility.
Everyone has a great facility.
They have a darn personable coach, though.
Sure they do.
You know, Matt Rhule's it.
He is
Personable
absolutely.
Guy. And I do feel like they think they're going to get a couple of these, high-level guys this weekend. Let's talk about that. Okay, so this weekend they have the two Bellevue West receivers, Isaiah McMorris and Devon Hall, coming in. And this would be interesting. If they're able to land those two, I don't think they're coming, just to hang out. I think this is a big moment for both of them. Would be a big moment for Danny Kaelin, who's coming, obviously to shepherd the whole thing home. So I think there's a sense and an understanding that there's a real chance that these two guys are in the fold. That would be a big coup for Nebraska. One of them's really, really good. I think Hall's got a lot of potential. Certainly sort of the prototypical 6'2", 185, beautiful runner kind of player. So I think he's good. And McMorris has a lot of Wandale qualities to his game. A ton. He's a good player. And very similar. Maybe not quite as explosive on the first step, but very similar player to a Wandale. Those two guys are coming. Carter Nelson is coming. Carter Nelson is interesting to me. He's 6'4", at about probably 205. You've obviously sat and talked to him.
Yeah.
I think it'd be fair to say it's going to take some time for him to get to the point where he's an inline tight end.
Yeah.
Like, 30 or 40 pounds.
Yeah, he'll need to add a lot of muscle, no doubt.
So he'll have to put on weight. But he's a top 100 kid who's got Georgia, Notre Dame. And I will say this. If Nebraska doesn't get him, and in back-to-back years, they get what I consider to be high-level tight ends, and they don't get either one of them, one of those, well, I'll be really honest with you, that's not good. That would hurt.
Sure.
Bramer would have come here if Scott Frost was the coach. He wasn't coming if it were, he probably wasn't going to come if it were anyone else but Scott. That's how much he likes Scott Frost. But Bramer was a hell of a player, and he's going to Iowa State, and I think he'll play right away. Carter Nelson, different player than Bramer. Bramer is like 6'7" and a half. Carter Nelson's a little shorter, although he can jump out of the gym. If they don't get either one of these guys, and they didn't get Burt, who I think is going to be a good player, and he goes to Iowa, I think that's kind of tough, especially for a team that says they love tight ends.
Yeah, of all the positions that Nebraska's had success with in the last few years, tight end would be the shining example of that.
So this is a big one. Danny Kaelin and Carter Nelson were at the College World Series last night. Watching LSU. Be cool if LSU needs to make this final, I think. If they win, right? Am I right? LSU needs to get in the final.
The crowds would definitely love that.
That makes it a lot better event, I
Sure.
think. And Wake's done a great job. But, so they're at the College World Series last night. That's pretty sweet. Obviously, there's a lot going into this visit. Grant Brix is coming. That's a huge visitor, literally. He's been to Oklahoma. He's been to Alabama. Again, Alabama just came up to Iowa and got Caden Proctor out of Southeast Polk High School. They're trying to get this kid from Logan Magnolia High School, which is what, 30 minutes from here?
Yeah, yep, just up I-29.
Yeah, up by Missouri Valley.
Right.
Have you ever been to a game there?
Many games there.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So, Alabama coming up here to... It's one thing to go to, suburban Des Moines, which is where Southeast Polk is.
Yep.
It's another to go to Logan Magnolia High School and go get a lineman.
You don't end up there by accident.
No. So, it's another thing for Georgia to go up to Ainsworth. Like, these schools are not afraid. They're not afraid to come up here now. And Now I think people are starting to better appreciate, oh, these kids are good. Oh. And here's another piece that I think should not be underrated. These kids are good, and they're not asking for any NIL money to play here. Doesn't mean we won't give them some, but they're not asking for $100,000. They're not looking for that. And I think that's probably, now that may change in 3 years, but I think as we sit here right in this moment, I don't think that's a huge consideration for a lot of these small town kids. I don't think they've thought about it that way.
What's their number one consideration? I would say it's development.
I think it's playing football. Yeah. I think it's going to the NFL, playing football. Going somewhere where they think they're going to get developed. I just don't think that. So what's your NIL deal for us is been like the first and most prominent question. Because, and it wasn't with Dylan Raiola, for what it's worth. I think that they're what I think some of these schools are running into is some of the situations that they're running into is these kids are like, well, this is what I'm looking for. Kind of like if you remember the movie Blue Chips, Ricky Rowe, basically saying, I want money in a bag, kind of like that. You can just put in one of those gym bags.
Yep.
Now, these kids are not asking for money under the table. They're asking for money over the table. But I think that's part of what's happening, man. Like, I don't think some of these kids are asking for as much NIL money. And so all of a sudden they become really appealing because that's not somebody that you have to worry about, keeping happy. Let me ask you, if you were a coach, and you had two prospects, and maybe this prospect A is a little bit better than prospect B, but prospect A is saying, here's what it's going to take to land me NIL, and prospect B is like, yeah, I haven't really thought much about that. What do you think of prospect A in terms of the maintenance that you're going to have for prospect A when they come in the door and they give you an NIL request?
I would say prospect A would have to be quite a bit better than prospect B. If it's close, if it's marginal, if it's a few percentage points, I'll take the low maintenance guy, the guy whose head is elsewhere.
Isn't it funny how we look at money? And money's got a unique relationship in our country, but it's funny how we would look at that, and I'm not lying, I would look at it the same way and think, because this person who certainly has value and has value to my team is asking to be compensated for that value, I have a lesser opinion of their maintenance ability. And we do. Like, we're just like, well, this. If you're going to come in here and ask for money, my God, you better be really good because you're coming in here asking for money. Of course, coaches do that all the time. Coaches ask for money.
We attach.
I'm not trying to criticize you. No, I'm just saying that is how we would look at it.
There's a moral thing that we attach to these things because forever it was illegal, and now it's not, and now it's perfectly within the rules and above board to ask for what kind of NIL deals am I going to get. But there's still this lingering sense of morality in there, I think, where it's just like, yeah, I didn't ask for money, so I'm better. I'm above that, It's a different deal.
Yeah.
But like the rules have changed, but I think the sentimentality is slow to catch up, which is fascinating to me.
The question I've gotten, and we'll finish with this. The question I've gotten the most around Jordy Ball is, what kind of NIL deal is she getting? And honestly, I don't know. Like, somebody sent me something like, oh, I'll bet she's getting $500,000. And I'm like, I don't know what she'd be getting it for. I certainly hope Nebraska didn't have to pony up that kind of money. Doesn't appear to be that, and I don't think she cares about that. I'm not saying she isn't getting any, but it's striking to me that like people are like, well, if the best athlete in the country wants to come to Nebraska, it can't possibly be because she just wants to be here. There's got to be some money involved. And I'm like, well, I don't know. It didn't seem like it when she was talking on Tuesday. It seemed like she wanted to be here. She talked about going to her brother's games at Midland.
Right. Her boyfriend's on the Nebraska baseball team. She's having the Storm Chasers are having Jordy Ball night. Like, there are opportunities. If she wants to run a camp, that thing will be swamped. Like, any opportunity that she has locally, she can hit on that.
I think she's going to have some pressure on her shoulders, but I think that it'll even out pretty quickly. Certainly, there's going to be thousands of people at every single one of her games. But, at the same time, the reality is unless she gets hurt, she's going to be good.
Sure.
Softball pitching tends to rely on dominance, and it relies on repetitive motion. And it's not hard to get in a rhythm, and she's really good. She's going to a league that isn't as good. The Big Ten is okay, but it's not as good as the Big 12. Not at all as good as the Big 12. Not even close. Big 12, by the way, has Oklahoma, Texas, for a little while longer. Oklahoma, Texas, Oklahoma State. All three are elite in softball. The Big Ten has one team that was elite, and that was Northwestern, but they weren't as good as the other three teams that I just mentioned. So, the chances of her throwing multiple no-hitters in Big Ten play next year are pretty high. None of those play. I don't think any of those teams have ever faced her. I don't think Wisconsin's played Oklahoma. Maybe Northwestern has. So they're going to be seeing her for the first time, and they're going to be like, we don't know what to do. So I think her advantage will be as a batter. I think she'll be able to be a big bat in the offense. One more bat that helps replace, I think, Maya Felder, who's leaving. And then it's my sense that they're going to get 2 or 3 high-level players who want to join her and be here. And the only thing that would have ever been keeping those players from coming here would have been, I'm not sure whether they can go to the World Series.
Mm-hmm.
But everything else, they have. Like, they have the stadium. It's nice. They have the facilities. They have the nutrition. They have people love women's athletics here. And she said it more than just about anywhere else in the country. Oklahoma's way up there. Yeah. She was at a school where they cared about it too. She may not feel that way, but she was. Gymnastics team, softball
absolutely.
Team, they care about it. And there's a few schools in the SEC. I think LSU cares a lot. I think Iowa cares a lot. But Nebraska's probably number one on the list. So there's going to be some gals that are transferring or in the portal, and they're going to be like, I wouldn't have considered that school before, but now that she's there, I will. And, by the way, I kind of like this place. So I think they're going to be a preseason top 10 team.
Pretty remarkable.
It is. It is that one player can do that, and that's probably that's one of the few sports where it's true.
She's doing in softball what we talked about with Dylan Raiola in football.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Changing the tide.
If Caitlin Clark, maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe. If Caitlin Clark transferred to Nebraska, I don't think they would be a preseason top 10 team. They might be. They might be, but I feel very confident that Jordy Ball makes Nebraska softball that. And maybe that's unfair to the current team there, but Nebraska has a number of players who are similar to Caitlin Clark, so it'd have to be a complete reorientation. Maybe I shouldn't use Caitlin Clark. I won't use Caitlin Clark. I'll use Angel Reese, who is, in my opinion, the second best player in college basketball. And Nebraska knows her, too. They faced her a couple times at Maryland. If Angel Reese could transfer to Nebraska, or Anissa Morrow, and Nebraska wanted her, if she had transferred to Nebraska, and she's really good, that was a gal that was at DePaul, her brother played at Nebraska, I don't think they would be preseason top 10. That's not a knock on Nebraska. That is, there's not enough that Morrow can do to shape a team the way that Ball can in softball, because softball is dominated by pitchers.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure there's a position in a team sport
right.
that is more crucial than a great pitcher. And Nebraska hasn't had a great pitcher. They haven't had a great pitcher since Edwards, but they haven't had a really good pitcher. Courtney Wallace is really good, but Ashley Hageman was probably the last.
Peaches James back in the day.
Peaches, yes. So Peaches was way back in the day.
Yeah.
And then, I think Tatum Edwards was in 2013, and those teams were really good when they had the Edwards sisters. I think this team could be almost as good because Jordy's there. And I actually think it's going to benefit her to have been at Oklahoma for 2 years. than to have been in Nebraska this whole time. I think she'll come to Nebraska and she'll have learned something about what it's like to be on a team where she is among many great players. She will have learned something about what it means to be really, really good, and she will be able to take the lessons that she learned there and share them. I think it'll make the team better. Whereas if she had just come to Nebraska, she probably would have been as good as she has been, but I don't think she would have been on a team that was 66-1. So there's something that you learn, and I think she's probably learned a lot from the culture there that she'll be able to sort of impute.
It's going to be remarkable. The crowds that are going to show up, the attention that it's going to get, the coverage, really fascinating.
Want to talk a little baseball real quick?
Sure, can do that. It's been interesting, man. I mean, like you mentioned, we haven't had a podcast since they made the move to hire Rob Childress as pitching coach, and it's been a really interesting month. I mean, we've talked about football recruiting and how that's been different. Baseball's been extremely active too, and this is more that time of year for that stuff. But it's been notable, even in the last few days, the impact that Rob Childress has had on the recruiting trail. I mean, he's a name, man. Like, even though he hasn't been the head coach at A&M for 3 years now, people know his name. Like, baseball community people, they all know who that guy is. They just recently got a commitment from a guy by the name of Tyner Horn, who's a pitcher from Kansas, who had been committed to Wichita State. He decommits because they have a coaching change. He hears from 80 schools, including Vanderbilt, Arkansas, some of the top powers in the sport, and commits to Nebraska because he wants to work with Rob Childress, and because he had a connection with Mike Sirianni, who was at Wichita State and is now at Nebraska too. But he did it in 3 days. He didn't even have to think about it. Like, he came to Nebraska that quickly. He's making an impact in the portal, in the high school realm. It's really been fascinating to see. So, it's and you've asked me this many times. Why didn't they make the move sooner? And we can have that discussion. But the fact of the matter is, like, there's just a lot of weight that he's carried on the recruiting trail. So it's unlike football. I think oftentimes if you have an impact baseball recruiting class, those guys make an immediate difference. I mean, you look at who's at the College World Series right now. It's freshmen that are on the mound that are dominating at the top teams. Some freshman hitters, but more freshman pitchers make a quick impact.
Yeah, once you get here, you can tell. I mean, the pitching this CWS has been determinative.
I mean, LSU, everyone talks about Paul Skeens, but they survived yesterday by throwing like 4 different freshman pitchers who got them through this thing. So, like, it happens. Like, if you're a really good program, you're going to rely on freshmen. When Nebraska was really good, they relied on freshmen, and those guys came through. So I'm keeping my eye on that as something. If you talk about, like, reasons for optimism next year, the talent that they're bringing in and just the nature of the game would say that if they can really flip things from a pitching perspective, it could get interesting. So I'm keeping my eye on that. It's been really fascinating to see.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that if they had best pitching staff in the country is Wake or Tennessee, right?
Wake, yeah, and Tennessee.
Well, here's how good Tennessee is. They're in the SEC, and they were that good. Here's how good Wake is. They were in the ACC, and that good. If Nebraska had a staff like Wake or Tennessee, I'm not saying they will, but if they did, I'm not sure they would lose in the Big Ten. Like, it would be it'd be like what Oral Roberts did.
In the Summit, yeah.
I mean, imagine Tennessee's ERA if they had to just, like, land in the Big Ten for a year. I mean, it'd be comical. So, Nebraska's, it feels like pitching is what you got to do. You've just got to, and obviously they made the change because they weren't bad, like you said. They weren't bad. But you also have to take into account that whatever their ERA ranking was, 39th?
Top 50 for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, but they were doing it in the Big Ten, so the Big Ten isn't very good.
Yeah, context matters, no doubt.
And so, like, if you took that staff and you put it in the SEC for a year, it wouldn't be top 50. Probably.
That's true.
And so, to be really elite, you probably have to be in the top 15 or the top 10 if you're playing a whole Big Ten schedule. And so, I think, maybe they can get there. I don't know. Like you mentioned Tyner Hort. The first name I thought of when Rob Childress was hired is, well, can he go do something with Drew Christo? Because Drew Christo is that guy, right? He had 80 calls or whatever. He could have gone anywhere in the country.
Could have gone to Stanford, yep.
And he just hasn't taken off yet. And I don't really understand pitching well enough to know how that's not possible. But obviously he hasn't. Because they didn't throw him very much. You know?
That's right. And guys develop at different rates, and you see all the time guys have great college seasons, and then the next year they fall off. I mean, it does happen.
Tennessee had a guy like that. I was looking through the notes. That had a guy that was great 2 years ago, and then he was a little less, not quite as good the year ago, and then he got a little worse again.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, like, you would hope that when you get a top recruit like this Tyner Hort guy, that you're able to, that he pans out.
Yeah.
And I'm at this point, because, I mean, it seems like they get a recruit every other day.
Yeah.
Every month. It's like, how many guys do you guys have? I'm a little skeptical and cynical. I'm like, okay, you did this wherever you were at, but Nebraska's had a lot of these guys in recent years, and they haven't been very good. They just don't pan out. The kid from A&M a couple years ago, boy, he was supposed to come in and he was supposed to be something.
Or Nellis, yeah.
And he just wasn't. So I just wondered, I think that's the area where Childress has got to get him going, is not just in signing the good player or landing the good player, but getting them to produce.
Mm-hmm. A few examples of that, but not a lot in the last 4 years. Emmett Olson was an example of that. He regressed this year. He would tell you that. He had an outstanding 2022 and took a step back, even though he had some great games. But yeah, I agree. I mean, that's the name of the game. You got to have arms. You got to have a lot of arms, and they got to be good. So we'll see if Nebraska can do it.
Well, I think it was probably a good investment. All right, that is our Pick 6 podcast for this week. For Evan, I'm Sam. We will be back. I think we'll be back next week to talk about whatever happens this crazy recruiting weekend. Talk a little bit recap the CWS. Maybe talk a little hoops. Take care, folks.